You see, here's the problem with showing favoritism. It's because I don't think we realize that we think of favoritism as kind of a lesser law to murder, pedophilia and all these things. But here's the way you can know. What was the greatest commandment or the royal law that he just said? Love God and love others, right? Even if you look at the government, the punishment of something is based on the importance of the law, right? The greater the law, the greater the punishment is if you break that law. Make sense? Like if you take 10 cents, that is different than murder because the commandment to take 10 cents is a lesser priority importance than the command to murder in society. If God was to categorize his laws, and Jesus said, what is the most important law, commandment? Love God, love others. So if you break the most important command, doesn't that require the greatest punishment? Where do you think favoritism falls into all of this? When you show favoritism, what are you really doing? You've broken the most important command. You didn't break a commandment. And James is going to show us, actually, when you break this commandment, you end up breaking all the other commandments directly or indirectly. Because these commandments are what? The fulfillment and the summary of all the commandments. When you fail to love your neighbor, you're actually guilty directly or indirectly of murder, stealing, adultery, all sorts of things. Because those are all pictures of loving others. And showing favoritism is breaking the greatest commandment, which is actually, should be the greatest punishment. Look at verse 8. This is why James says it like this. If you fulfill notice the term he uses now, royal law, before he called it the law of freedom. Now he's calling the royal law, the law that goes back to a king. Which king? His brother. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing well, right? So do you see, this is exactly what James is saying, what I just said. He's pointing out that his brother said this is the most important commandment, right? We all agree with that. The most important commandment is love God, love other people, love your neighbor as yourself. So if you break the most important commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, you deserve the greatest punishment. That's why favoritism is such a big deal to James. Do you see that? I think it's because James knows we don't categorize favoritism that way. Because if someone came up to you and say, you know what, I just murdered somebody yesterday, we will have a very different reaction to that person versus somebody say, you know what, I dismissed this poor person because I wanted to talk to a rich person. Are you more shocked about the second person or the first person? We'll be more shocked about someone who murdered. But what is James saying? That is just as bad as this. Look at how he says in verse 10 through 11. Whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. For if you do not commit adultery but do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. This is where James is talking about the law is not like a bunch of bowling pins and your point is to trying to be above average. The law is a mirror. It's a window. One crack in the window, the whole thing is compromised. So here's James's analogy. He says, what if a person came up to you and says, I've always been faithful to my wife and husband. Oh, that's good. Never committed adultery. Great. I just kill people every other week though. But with God, I'm good, right? Because at least I didn't commit adultery even though I murder. We will say, it doesn't matter if you're committing adultery because you're killing people, right? It's like clearly something's wrong with your understanding of God and his law. You cannot pick and choose which commandments you obey and think that you're quote unquote okay because you did the big things for God and you broke the little things. Yes, I don't murder. I don't commit adultery. So what if I do a little favoritism here and there? James is saying, the favoritism here and there is the big thing because you're breaking the greatest commandment. And if you're breaking that commandment, your whole window is cracked. It doesn't matter all the good commandments you're doing if you've broken the most important commandment. You cannot pick and choose God's law. They're all one package deal. And in fact, if you were going to be technical about what is the greatest commandment that deserves the greatest punishment, it actually should be favoritism because that breaks the greatest commandment of loving your neighbor as yourself. And so for James, he's saying those with living faith will love all people. Those who truly are living by God's faith and wisdom, they will fulfill the greatest commandment and not just pick and choose which commandments they're going to follow. Verse 12, so speak and so act as those who are to be judged under, and he goes back to what? The law of liberty. Live as a person who live according to God's law of freedom as opposed to your own legalistic, self-created commandments where you pick and choose what you will obey. That's what he's saying. Live by God's freedom, path of freedom, as opposed to your own religious rules that you're making up as you go. You know, religious people, they make up a lot of rules that aren't in the Bible. And it's inconsistent if you really think about it. You can't spend money on Sunday. You got to come to church and don't curse. But on Monday, cheat on your taxes and do this to your wife and drink. Where is that? How does that make any sense? You see, when you are religious and you make these commandments and you pick and choose what you do, you know what you're really doing? You're trying to make it easy for yourself. Because it's hard to do this too. So you make a whole list of commandments that are easier for you to do so that you can feel better about yourself than other people. So you make up these rules saying, okay, church attendance is about church attendance. And so you come to church every, Sunday. And then you start to look down on people that don't. And you say, well, at least I made it. And you made this arbitrary rule of standard. You're comparing your other self. And what you're doing is you're creating your own list of rules that has nothing to do with God's standard of love. This is a test I often do in my own head. I notice that people tend to emphasize the commandments that's easy for them to follow and de-emphasize the commandments that's hard for them to follow. Like, for example, I have a friend who can't even drink because he's allergic to alcohol, but he's very legalistic about alcohol. If you really love God, you wouldn't even look at alcohol. It's like, it's easy for you to say you're allergic to it, right? Or it's like me saying, if you really love God, you wouldn't eat kale. That's easy for me because I don't like kale. And so what do? We tend to emphasize the commandments that are easy for us. The homosexuals, they're the worst kind of sinners. That's easy for you to say because you don't struggle with same-sex attraction. Why don't you speak just as loudly about fornication, same-sex or heterosexual sin? Why don't you talk about pornography loudly? Why aren't you speaking so loudly about that? Because, now it starts getting personal. Do you see what we do? We highlight the commandments that's easy for us to do, and we de-emphasize the one. And what are we really doing? James is saying, you're picking and choosing. Hey, I don't commit adultery, I just murder. Hey, yeah, I show favoritism, but I come out to Sundays. You're a lawbreaker. Either way. Because failing to love people is a failure to fulfill God's greatest commandments.